Hey everybody, welcome back to this week's episode of the Oral Talmud. I'm Dan Levinson and I'm here with B'nai Lappy. How you doing, B'nai?
Hey Dan, I'm doing great. How are you?
I'm good. I actually just had a session, a learning session with some of our viewers yesterday, and it was a lot of fun. And they pointed out they sort of implied to me that I start the show in the same way every time, and now I can't remember how I started. Interesting. But I think it's the hi B'nai. Yeah. Anyway,
Yeah.
by the way, I'll note that if there are other groups out there that are watching this show or listening to this show and would like to have real time conversation with us, or at least I'll volunteer myself, I would love to do that. That was a lot of fun for me. So 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 we're going to jump back into our text that we did last week. I would say that probably this is one of those episodes that if you haven't watched last week's episode, which was number 57, I believe, that you should watch that one before you watch this one, because we're mostly going to just jump into a conversation that we started last week. But to do a little bit of a recap, we're talking about this famous story of what's called the lovesick man. Seems like a misnomer because I'm not sure that it's love. But
That's one of the issues that
uh-huh.
we're going to get to this week. Is it
Okay.
love or is it something else?
Okay, good. But in any event, so we say that with consciousness of the problematic of the title, but it's known as the Lovesick Man story. And so just a quick recap of where we were last week. The first thing that I just want to point out, because it will come back in our conversation, I think in the second half, is just where this stems from in the Mishnah, which is this idea that that there's this principle that if a person is told transgress or I will kill you, in other words, that there's a rule or a law that in the Torah, and somebody's saying you should eat that ham and cheese sandwich or I'll kill you. You should eat the ham and cheese sandwich, and that's a principle, a rabbinic principle that they establish. I mean, they claim that they didn't establish it, that it's always been there, but that basically allows any Torah rule to be evaded or avoided or whatever verb you want to use, if the consequence of performing it is that you would be killed, either that you would be killed because somebody's going to kill you, or in the case of that, an illness. I mean, to some extent, this is a source for the idea of pikuach nefesh, which a lot of people are aware of, which is the idea that it's not that somebody's going to kill you, it's just that you're going to die if you don't do something. For example, taking medicine on Shabbat. Nobody's going to kill you, but you need the medicine and you have to cook it on Shabbat. You can do that because it's basically the same principle that you shouldn't be killed, you shouldn't die in the effort to live up to all the Torah's commandments, except for three exceptions, which are idol worship, forbidden sexual relations, whatever that means exactly, and bloodshed, which basically means killing another person. So you shouldn't kill another person.
I would put an even sharper point on bloodshed. I would say it's murder. In other words, killing an innocent
Uh-huh.
person.
Uh-huh.
Because killing the person, if the threat to your life is another person threatening your
Uh-huh.
life, killing the person who's threatening your life is permitted,
Yes.
and that isn't considered murder. That's considered killing, but not an innocent person, and therefore that would be okay. So it's actually murder, killing of an innocent person, that's forbidden,
Okay.
even to save your life. Okay.
So there's a lot, it's sometimes a little hard to hold all this in your head because there's like double negatives and all kinds of things like that. But basically what's going on here is that the rabbis are saying, don't 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 allow yourself to be killed just because you're trying to follow the rules of the Torah, except for only three and only three exceptions, which are idol worship, forbidden sexual relations, and bloodshed. And then we get into this story in the Talmud, in the Gemara, where they're essentially adding a fourth category, or maybe a number of fourth categories, fifth, sixth, right? But they're saying that there's a case here. So here's the case of the lovesick man. There's a man who claims, doctors affirm, that if he doesn't have sex with a particular woman, it's not, by the way, that's occurring to me, right? It's not just any woman, it's a particular woman. That if he doesn't have sex with her, he's going to die. And the Talmud says, well, let him die, because we're not going to force this woman to have sex with him in order to preserve his life, even though that's actually not in the technical case of what forbidden sexual relations means in the Mishnah. It's this situation is not one of them, or apparently they do float this idea that maybe it is one of them, but there's a sense that no, even if it wouldn't be forbidden, we're not going to allow him to do that just to preserve his life. And so that's potentially adding some kind of fourth category. We could call it inadvisable sexual relations. We could call it we could define the category in different ways. And yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, it could be unwanted, non-mutual. When the sexual encounter is an objectification, there's something. And it's really interesting that this story comes to undermine the very radical law that was established just one page ago.
About that you can violate any commandment in order
to save a life.
Mm-hmm.
And then all of a sudden we have a story of a person whose life is in danger. And even if the possibility of him having sex with this woman is in the category of the sexual relations exception, which is something that you shouldn't do even to save a life, certainly the other possible behaviors, that he should speak to her from that she should appear naked before him and he doesn't touch her, or that he should be able to speak to her from behind a wall, certainly those aren't in the category of the exception of sexual relations that you should not violate even to save your life. And the question is, the rabbis are letting him die. So that's very much an undermining of that law that we just saw. And that's what's interesting about the story.
Right. And so that's the thing. It's like, if it's about their having sex, then you could say, well, we're adding some kind of unwanted sexual relations category or something like that. Or one of the objections that the rabbis raise is, or one of the explanations that they float as to why this might be the rule, is that maybe she was married, in which case it would be a forbidden sexual relation. So they're saying we're not adding a fourth category, where this happens to just be a case of that second category, but that's dismissed. And then there's also this issue, like you just mentioned, that later, and this is to me kind of comical, that they say, well, no, let him die, and then the doctors come back, no, actually she could just stand there naked, or she could just talk to him from behind a wall. So there's something also going on here where, well, maybe that initial claim, maybe we want to push against the initial claim because maybe it's not so simple. It's not actually needed and we want to be very careful not to treat somebody as an object or mistreat somebody. So we're at least going to push against the claim that this is going to cause me to die. But they get to this point where they say, no, even if all he needs is to talk to her from behind a wall, he's not even going to see her, just needs to talk to her. We're not going to force her to talk to him in order to preserve his life. And you can't really say, well, that's a kind of forbidden sexual relation at that point. So there's some fourth category that's being added here. One of the possibilities that gets floated is what's called family flaw, which is basically this idea of a reputational harm to the family. And so then, you would...
To the family of the woman.
To the family of the woman, right? And then you would kind of go back and you'd say, well, this is the halacha, this is the rule that you should violate any Torah prohibition if you would die if you didn't violate it, except for the cases of idol worship, forbidden sexual relations, bloodshed, and causing reputational harm, right? I mean, that would be the implication there. And so it seems that what they're doing is in some fashion adding a fourth category. And ultimately, one thing that I want to talk about later is how big is that fourth category, and why are they adding it? And are we, is it really right to say that they've added a fourth category, et cetera, what's the basis for that? But that seems to be what's going on here.
Well, what I was excited about in the place we got to at the end of last week was that as you were surfacing, maybe this is about a fourth category, the idea that maybe it's not a fourth category at all. Maybe this story is leaving open the question of this fourth category and not nailing it down to say, to sort of permanently open the paradigm of the three exceptions that you should rather die for than violate, so that in any given time in the future, there's always the possibility of another category of harm that's so profound that we should really allow ourselves to die rather than commit. I think that's a much more powerful takeaway than even nailing down the fourth category. It's like there will always be the possibility of another category. Whatever it is in your time, you have, that's your job to figure out what's our fourth category that never is nailed down. Anyway.
No, that's interesting. I mean, it does get so complex with the double negatives because, at some point we have to look at, well, these are idol worship, forbidden sexual relations, and bloodshed. Like these are prohibitions that the Torah very explicitly states. They could have, it might not be clear exactly what falls under them. So if we're adding a fourth category, does that have to be something that the Torah explicitly states? Like, for example, this idea of the family flaw, right? Well, there are things in the Torah that talk about not harming people with words. There are ways that we could say, well, that actually is a prohibition of the Torah that you're not allowed to violate. But there's also, it seems like something like that is a little bit goes beyond that. It's adding a prohibition that we don't even see explicitly in the Torah.
Yeah, which I think is an even more powerful precedent. Even the suggestion that that's the concern, which we should be so careful about, that we should even let someone die rather than violate. I think that's really interesting. And there are all sorts of negative commandments that we're allowed to violate to save our life that aren't in the list. I don't know.
Right.
Anyway,
it does get very confusing.
It is. The negatives are confusing.
Right. Well, so that's basically where we left it last week, and let's go back and just finish the text and talk about the text, and then I think we'll have time after that to talk about some of these larger implications. So we were here saying that basically, okay, so there's this thing. Maybe the reason is because it'll cause reputational harm to the woman's family. So then Rav Acha, son of Rav Ika, says, this is so that the daughters of Israel should not be promiscuous with regard to forbidden sexual relations. So say, no, it's not that. It's that if we allowed this to happen, if we allowed this sex to happen that shouldn't have happened, but it's done to save a life, that might somehow be misinterpreted as that it's okay to have these kind of sexual relations that we're trying to not encourage, and we don't want to slide down that slippery slope. One thing that I would just say is that some of these kind of objections are standard rabbinic sort of ways that they construct legal rules. That's often famously known as building a fence around the law, right? Meaning that we're going to say a certain thing that actually isn't forbidden, we're going to forbid it, because if you do it, then you might be more likely to do the thing that actually is forbidden. The problem here is that it feels to me like you can't really use that legal reasoning in a situation that's saying these are the cases where it's obligatory to violate law in order to save a life, because saving a life is so important. And then you expand the exception, really, right? By expanding an exception, right? This is where the double negatives get confusing. But by expanding an exception, you're actually contracting the rule, right? By definition. And if the rule is that we will do everything that we can to save a life, except for these very limited exceptions, if you expand those exceptions, then you're causing somebody to die unnecessarily because you're trying to build a fence around the law, which seems like something that you shouldn't do. And so it feels to me like, on the one hand, you can appreciate these concerns that say we don't want to cause reputational harm to families, or we don't want to send the wrong message that things that, sex should be had more freely. But actually, it would be troubling to use that reasoning at the expense of somebody's life if you think that that's so important.
You're making me wonder whether the these two possibilities, the Gemara, the Gemara here is trying to figure out why the rabbis are letting this guy die. I think they're the text is struggling with that, and they're trying to find some way to reconcile letting him die with the law we had on the last page, and the inadequacy of these solutions. Oh, maybe we're letting him die. Maybe it makes sense to let him die because these possibilities, the reputational harm or the diminishment of sort of sexual mores, maybe that's a justification for letting him die. The inadequacy of these explanations could be what motivates the text to go where it goes next, which is the final attempt to reconcile the rabbis letting this man die with our enormous concern for life and our willingness to violate virtually the entire Torah to save a life at any given moment. So,
okay, so let's go to that. So,
okay.
So the Talmud goes on to say, okay, but wait a second. If the woman was unmarried, let him marry her, right? So if he marries her, then it's not a forbidden sexual relation in any way. There's no family reputational harm. There's no concerns about a slippery slope because we're not having some kind of illicit sex that's okay in one circumstance, but not in another circumstance. This is a man marries a woman. They can do whatever they want. It's a standard. So
right.
Why isn't that a clean solution to the problem?
Exactly. If he marries her, he can have sex with her, and then he'll be cured and he'll live.
Right.
Seems like a great solution.
Now, I would note that, and there are other texts that we'll look at in a few weeks, I think that, where I think there's a little bit of I don't know if this is exactly the right way to use it, like the dog didn't bark kind of issue here, where you wish that they would come in and say, no, that can't happen because she's a person and she shouldn't have to marry a man she doesn't love, et cetera, et cetera. But that just doesn't come up, right? That's not said that, no, this would somehow be a problem for her. So.
Yeah, I think that's the unarticulated message underneath the text. For me, that seems obvious, but you're right. It would be nice if they said it.
Oh, you think it's obvious that they are concerned about that?
Yeah.
I think that feels right to me on a certain level, and then the question is, well, why don't they say it more explicitly?
Yeah. Well, let's unpack the end,
okay,
and let's figure out whether the end of the story, as the editor has constructed the story, undermines our confidence that the rabbis were really concerned with the dignity of the woman.
Okay, so the Talmud is raising this seemingly simple and effective answer to the problem, which is that if she was unmarried, if she's married, of course he can't do it. That would be a forbidden sexual relation, and that's one of our 3 exceptions. If she's not married, then let him just marry her, and then it's fine. And the response is, no, that wouldn't work. His mind would not have been eased. That's the response, is to say, no, that it's just that wouldn't work. In accordance with the statement of Rabbi Yitzchak, as Rabbi Yitzchak says, ever since the day the temple was destroyed, sexual pleasure was taken away. And the explanation here is from those who engage in permitted intercourse. In other words, there's this very sad, it seems to be like a very sad sort of worldview. But the idea is that nobody gets sexual pleasure anymore from, permitted sex since the temple was destroyed. It really makes me wonder about, Rabbi Yitzchak.
Well, let's come back to that, because what Rabbi Yitzchak is suggesting is that, you know, the world was disrupted in
Mhm.
such a profound way that once the temple was destroyed, that without a temple, none of us can actually be healthy human beings. But
Mhm.
we'll get there.
Okay. So ever since the day the temple was destroyed, sexual pleasure was taken away and given to transgressors. As it is stated in Proverbs, stolen waters are sweet, and bread eaten in secret is pleasant. So, and then the explanation here is that therefore that, in other words, what was bothering him, he was looking for some kind of pleasure. This man who said, "I'm going to die if I don't have her," he's saying he's looking for something, a feeling like a charge, a pleasure, whatever we want to call it, and he could only get that if he was not married to her and the sex was illicit.
Right.
And as soon as he married her, it would not be illicit anymore, and then it wouldn't actually cure his disease, so he would die anyway. Is
E-
the implication?
exactly. Oh my God, there's so much to unpack here. So one thing is this last story, this last piece of the story that Rabbi Yitzchak says is, it's like, no. This guy wasn't lovesick. This guy was sick.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
This has nothing to do with love, Rabbi Yitzchak is saying. He's saying this man had a, I don't want to use the word perverted, but some sort of unhealthy desire, a
Mm-hmm.
desire which could only be satisfied if there was a forbidden aspect to the sex. And it feels like Rabbi Yitzchak, the Talmud is basically saying, you thought we were dealing with sort of a healthy love. That's not what the whole story, you misunderstood the story. You misunderstood what was going on. This guy has a problem. And what's fascinating is we all have a problem. That's what Rabbi Yitzchak is saying, that once the temple is destroyed, we are all in a state of unhealthy living, and our desires can only be satisfied in forbidden ways. I don't know, it's profound. It's a categorical condemnation of healthy sexuality. I don't know what is going on
Mm-hmm.
for Rabbi Yitzchak, but he's pointing to the destruction of the temple, and he's saying the world from that point is messed up, and
Mm-hmm.
we're all messed up. And I don't know, what do you make of it?
Well, it's that all we're messed up. That we're all messed up is challenging because because on the one hand you could see, like, if they're saying forget about the temple being destroyed part. If it was just saying, look, let's actually limit this case. Like you thought that this was a broad case about people that claim that they can only, that they'll die if they don't have sex with a particular person. It turns out no. It's a more limited case of a man who has this disease, or this whatever, and part of it is that he can only have sex with people that he's not married to, right? That this is a very, very narrow case of a person with a particular issue, and we're not going to, introduce some new principle of Torah in order to solve some issue of a very narrow group of people. And this was actually a case that's about a person who would die only if he couldn't, if he could have sex with somebody who wasn't married. And okay, so then you could say, all right, well, that's that. Then we could have a certain conversation about where that leads, right? Because you could say, actually, we got a note from a viewer from last week who said, maybe what the rabbis are just saying here to this particular man is, you got to grow up. This is a simple case. This is saying, like, this is kind of a ridiculous, as I understood the listener comment here, that this is a ridiculous notion, that you say you're going to die if you don't, or maybe maybe that's too harsh of a way, that what he really has is that he needs therapy, or that he in others, there are ways to help this man other than having sex with the woman. And we're not really that into this claim that he's going to die immediately. What does that mean? Does that mean he's going to kill himself? He's going to die? We don't quite, we're not really on board with this. And we're going to intervene in some other way, and he should just kind of grow up. That was how the comment that was sent to us said he should grow up. But if it is all of us, that's a different story.
Well, addressing the listener's comment, I still think the rabbis are letting this guy die.
Uh-huh.
I think they're accepting the doctor's claim that he will die if he doesn't either have sex or talk to her behind a wall or see her naked. And they're saying that there's no cure for him. That we're not going to demean this woman for his benefit and allow an illicit encounter. And I think they're still standing by their concern for women generally. But I think they are letting him die. And I can't make up my mind as to whether this last piece that Rabbi Yitzchak is saying is a positive or a negative. It could be a positive in that it's basically interrogating the notion that a person who would die if he doesn't have sex with someone or look at a woman naked or so on. The rabbis are saying that's messed up. We're not, and we're not going to demean a woman to help such a person. And Barry Wimpheimer notes in his book Narrating the Law that this type of story is a common Greco-Roman tale, and the rabbis are borrowing it from that culture. And one thing I want to ask Barry, and maybe we can have him on our show to talk about this, is whether what the rabbis are adding to the Greco-Roman tale is the undermining of the assumption that this is a person who really is in love. Could the rabbinic contribution here be the interrogation of the claim of real love? Uh-huh. So I like that about it, if that's what's going on. The downside of Rabbi Yitzchak could be that the opening up of a fourth category only applies to a person in this super narrow category of unhealthy sexual, and I don't want that to be the case, and I don't think that's really what's going on, but I'm not sure. I can't make up my mind.
Mm-hmm. Well, so to do full justice to the listener comment, I think, as I understand it, he was saying, and this is just a disagreement with the way that you framed it, that the rabbis are a little bit playing chicken with this guy, and they're saying, we really don't believe you, that you're gonna die if you don't, and we're not going to set a precedent for everybody based on this claim. And so, if you're gonna die, then we made a mistake, or something like that, right? But in others, we're gonna test, and I do think there is some support for that in the sense that they say no, and then the doctors come back and say, well, they don't have to have sex, and they don't have to see her naked. So right. Just putting it out there.
Okay, well, here's another possibility. Barry Wimpheimer also points out that this story appears in the Yerushalmi, right? The Palestinian Talmud, as well as the Babylonian Talmud. And over there in the Yerushalmi, there's no mention of doctors at all. Uh-huh. The doctors aren't players in the story at all. It's the rabbis who are diagnosing the man as unhelpable and saying they should die. Now I'm wondering whether the introduction of the doctors is a way for the rabbis to go, it's not us saying he's going to die. He's really, really, really going to die because the doctor said so. Uh-huh. So that could speak to this listener's idea that they're playing chicken. That the rabbis are really saying, no, doctor said so. He is going to die. Know that. That's a given. And
Except it's not. That's the only thing that I want it right, because they do back off of it. So there's something there. I'm not totally sure that we, have it.
Stop, but they stop backing off. There's a point.
There's a point. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, and anyway, I don't think that's the most important thing necessarily but I think it's interesting. Both possibilities are interesting. I would note just for a little bit of comedy, comedic interlude. This commenter also says, I realize this doesn't lead to your discussion of how the rabbis give us the keys to rebuild in our new era, but does every session have to be used to demonstrate that? and I kind of say, well, that is kind of our mission on this show. So maybe yes, but yes, not it doesn't always have to be, for sure.
Yeah.
But we do try to pick texts that have some relation to that. So, we could do a parallel Oral Talmud show where we would not look at I mean, you might claim, and other people, our first guest, David Kramer, might claim that every page of the Talmud is that, so maybe we can't even do a separate Oral Talmud show where we only look at texts that don't give you the keys to undo that. But in any event, I feel seen and understood by this listener. So thank you.
He's getting it.
So but here's the thing, I think that if it's not just this, so I mean, it may be another contribution here of the Bavli in this last part, which I find sort of troubling, right? In other words, I find it's sort of troubling, this idea that ever since the temple was destroyed, there's no such thing as sexual pleasure anymore in permitted sex. I mean, I don't think that that's true. So what does that mean? But I will say, at least from a kind of argument construction standpoint, it feels to me like what a claim like that is saying is, this isn't just about this one. Don't read this as a story about this one sort of deviant person who has his own stuff and it doesn't really relate to you. Somehow there's an effort to say, this is actually a story. This is a case that actually has wide applicability, in the sense that we all have elements of this. It may not be exactly the same case. So it may not be that we all want to have sex with somebody or we're going to die, but there is something where we're living in a broken world, all kinds of, if the idea that we should kind of live by the rules is unsatisfying in a way that maybe it wasn't unsatisfying in a previous, glorious golden era.
Imagined era.
Yeah, imagined. And we're going to have to, and it may not be this case, but there are going to be other cases that all of us are going to have where it's only in the violation of some rule from that imagined golden age that we're going to have our pleasure or our joy. And we can make these claims that say the only way that we can express that joy is to do various things. And some of those things are fine, and some of those things may not be fine. And then the question would be, what is the principle being articulated here of when it's not fine? And that goes back to what you've been saying. And I agree. I don't know if it's what the rabbi, I don't know exactly if we got the rabbis into a time machine and explained to them some of our modern concepts. Would they be saying, oh yeah, that's what we were saying all along, that we don't want to treat a woman as an object? Or would they have some other reason why they were concerned here? I don't know. I'm not sure. But
well, the rabbis themselves, they already have a concept called kavod habriot, respect for creatures. In other words, human dignity. That's their term for human dignity. And elsewhere in the Talmud, they say you can violate any prohibition in the Torah. And over there, they don't even name an exception, rather than violate someone's human dignity.
We should look at that.
We should go there next.
Okay.
So now that I hadn't thought about that before in relation to this text, but knowing that, I think is what made me assume that that was the concern that the rabbis for sure had, because I know elsewhere they say, we're so concerned about human dignity that rather than violate someone's human dignity, you should violate any prohibition in the Torah. I had another thought as you were talking, and that is maybe this last piece about sexual desire can, once the temple was destroyed, could only be fulfilled in illicit ways. I wonder if this is like one of those stories, you know, why the giraffe has a long neck, and what are those called?
Just so stories.
Just so stories, right? Maybe this is a just so story about sexual desire, and they're trying to explain why is it that there's something extra tasty about sex in socially forbidden ways. Like that's, I think there's something there,
Uh-huh.
right?
Uh-huh.
And maybe the rabbis are kind of normalizing that by saying, oh yeah, that's part of human nature now, you
Uh-huh.
know,
Uh-huh.
because the temple's destroyed, and that's why we all have that impulse now. That's a natural impulse. There's something there.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. It kind of like I feel like a lot of times when Jews talk about what's the difference between Judaism and Christianity, they'll talk about how Christianity has this idea of the fall in the creation story, in the Adam and Eve story, and ever since then we are fallen.
Yeah, yeah.
We're right, and we don't have that in Judaism. We don't believe in that in Judaism. And actually, a story like this makes me think, oh, actually, we do. It's just not located to the creation story. It's located to the destruction of the temple. And there's some notion here. It's not exactly the same thing, but there's some notion here that's the kind of mythic divide between a sort of imagined past and a real present and future. And we understand about ourselves that we have all kinds of, things that we're ashamed of, let's say. And it wasn't always that way. And so you have to understand that some of the rules in the Torah and some of the worldview of the Torah is it for people who are living in that golden age. But now we're living in this fallen age, and maybe it's a little different, or not. But I mean that we have to understand. I mean, I have to think through exactly what the implications are of that. But at least there's something here that I'm seeing that suggests, wow, like again, I don't know exactly what this means, that licit sexual pleasure was taken away ever since. Again, like I don't think that accords with it just feels like that just feels like an unhealthy, like I just, again, I feel kind of weird about Rabbi Yitzchak. It's like what, like it feels like this comment kind of suggests something that I don't think is correct. So I'm
Yeah,
not
well,
100% sure.
as a sexual outlaw myself, there's something here that now I'm starting to see as normalizing and as koshering
Yes.
of what had previously been bad and now is just human nature. And even though in this particular case, this has gone beyond the line,
Right.
I think this is opening up some spectrum of, yeah, that's understandable. That's human now. That I don't know. There's
that's very interesting, right? Like that is something that I feel like, yeah, we should come back to. We should sort of figure that out and find, are there other texts that kind of suggest, because I think you're right. Like in this particular text, even though whatever you think of that comment and that notion, they're saying, well, okay, but something has changed, and joy, pleasure only comes to illicit sex now, but you can't do it if it's going to objectify another person.
Right. Right. I think they're opening up a giant can of worms while trying to close up a little can of worms over here. Right. And maybe the message of Rabbi Yitzchak's addition here ultimately isn't about this guy. It's getting out onto the table the notion that don't feel bad. Don't feel like there's something wrong with you if, I don't know, maybe I'm overly personalizing this, but I just think it's opening up a recognition that there's something that's extra charged in the sexual desire or the I don't know what, in ways that are not yet socially acceptable, which might be okay, that are okay until they cross over a certain line of non-consensual or something else. So,
I mean, there's another way that this sort of is registering with me in a particular way right now, because as I've said a number of times, my wife and I have been doing the daily Talmud page together, and now while we're recording this, we're on the tractate called Yoma, which is about Yom Kippur and all its practices, and it's just this feeling to me like that what they're describing is it just never happened. Like there's so much description about like golden shovels and all kinds of like incredibly ornate things and customs. It's very hard for me to believe that that's really how it was. It really has the feel of this imagined fairy tale world of how things were in the good old days. And now it's possible that in Herod's temple, which was in the last 100 years of the Second Temple period, some of this really fancy stuff did happen because Herod was very wanting things to be extremely great and the fanciest of the whole Roman Empire and everything. So maybe some of this did happen in the last years of the temple, that these services became so ornate. But even if they did, it was not the way that it was for the 1,000 years before. And nevertheless, the Mishnah and then the Talmud imagines this extremely this really, I mean, literally a golden age. Everything was gold, and it just strikes me, that it's interesting to look at a little comment like this that really looks at this temple period as I think there's a word for like a mythic time. Like it's a not a, I can't remember the terminology, but like it really, it's not, people don't really think it happened. But it's almost like Lord of the Rings. Like it's really, it's like, Lord of the Rings was written to be a mythic prehistory of England. Of course, nobody believes that there was actually that story happened. Everyone knows J.R.R. Tolkien wrote it, but nevertheless, he wrote it to kind of function as a kind of mythic prehistory for England, which didn't have a mythic prehistory because it's an island and not that many people lived there before the Norman conquest. Whatever. I don't know the history so well. I don't want to get it wrong, but they didn't have the same kind of mythology that they had in Norse mythology and whatever. So so it just sort of has this feeling like, well, like again, in the way that I think in Christianity, they sort of imagine the Garden of Eden being this sort of that mythic time where there was a break. It's just interesting to me to note that I think that in the mind of the rabbis, that time before rabbinic Judaism, they had a very like interflowing, unclear difference between myth and fact, history and reality, and I think that and it strikes me that they didn't really care that much, that they were looking at that whole thing as this golden age that may or may not have ever they could say whatever they want about it, like in other words, they're constructing a golden age as opposed to, I think, how we're taught to think about it as like, oh, this happened and then this happened and this happened and then rabbinic Judaism came along, and I don't know if that's an important point, but it's just striking me with a comment like this that says, yeah, wow, the destruction of the temple was such an enormous, it wasn't just like the temple was destroyed and then we needed to have a new kind of Judaism. It was like the temple was destroyed and the world changed in a profound way that changed internal feelings of sexual pleasure, right? I mean, it's right. I don't know.
yeah.
I don't know if that's an important point.
Yeah, I'm not quite clear about this thought that you're helping me form, but I'm beginning to see that mythologization, I don't know, the mythology making, the mythic making of the past could be a way to explain the messy, imperfect nature of the present. It's like, don't blame us. It's not that our new system is raggedy.
Right.
It's that things are raggedy because that mythic time is over. And this is okay. The raggediness and the messed up, it's okay. It's all okay. And it's not a reflection on us. And this what you're describing could be a way to explain or comfort themselves and their detractors. I don't know.
Well, and I think what I'm trying to get is like there's a notion here that people have changed. It's not just that times have changed. It's not just that we find ourselves in this exile. It's that we're like different people. From something really broke in humanity when the temple is destroyed, and so there's going to have to be a reckoning there where we look at the Torah, we look even at the temple period, and we say, okay, it happened this way, it happened this way, but those were different people. They were pure people. We are broken people. So it's going to have to be different. Something like that is there, and I hope maybe we can tease it out.
Yeah, you know what just came up for me? You know, this period we're in of not exactly post-pandemic, but coming out of pandemic, and there's some way that we're still a little broken and we haven't quite recovered, and I'm not sure if we're going to be like we were.
Yeah.
I don't know. There's something that's resonating for me in that.
Yeah. So I want to make like a little bit of maybe a sharp turn here in the 15 minutes or so that we have remaining, just to talk about a little bit of a legal analysis that I think is going on here that I think is interesting. And ultimately, this goes to the listener comment about, does everything have to be about the keys to the, and I actually think there is a key here that I want to spend some time on, because I think it's actually pretty significant. And maybe when we connect it to that text that you mentioned about violating anything for the dignity of creation, we'll find some connection there. So I think it's this question about the fourth category. So the basic claim here is that there are three Torah prohibitions that you cannot violate, even if you're going to be killed.
Right. Do not murder. Do not worship idols. Do not have these kinds of sexual relationships, incest, adultery.
Right. And apparently there is at least a fourth, because there is some there we don't really resolve it here, but there is some reason why you're not allowed to even talk to a woman behind a fence if your claim is that you're going to die otherwise. Now we can imagine all kinds of possibilities. So what is that fourth category? And is it narrow? Does it only relate to sex in some way? Not sex, but relations between men and women, or something, however you want to define that category. Or is it a broad category that could relate to any relations with people? Or is it an even broader category that goes beyond? So what is that category, and how is it defined? And it makes me think about the right of privacy in the Constitution, which is similarly not actually in the Constitution, right? In other words, that there's nowhere in the Constitution where it says that people have a right to privacy. And the reasoning in, I think the initial case was Griswold versus Connecticut, the case that established that that married people could have birth control. I think that's what, but it was a progenitor case ultimately to Roe v. Wade. So it's in that line of cases that established this right to privacy. And the way that they got there was they said, okay, we have various rights in the Constitution that are explicit. There's a right to be free from unlawful searches and seizures, right? There's a law to not have to incriminate yourself, to not have, I think, again, I haven't looked back at the case, but I think it's like, right, because that's private. Like I shouldn't be forced to say what's in my heart that I did if it's going to incriminate me, right? So, and I shouldn't have to allow the police to come to my house without a warrant to search my house. And you can read those in a very narrow way and say, well, that's because your home is inviolate. That's because we don't want to force you to, a person shouldn't be forced to put themselves in prison or whatever. But the Supreme Court in that line of cases, and I think that it was Louis Brandeis that originally had written an article that they had based this on before he was a Supreme Court justice, was that they said, well, you have to understand, in the term that they used, and I think we've talked about in this show before, was penumbras and emanations, that each of these rules, each of these, there's a right to be free of searches and seizures. That's a narrow thing, but imagine there's kind of like a cloud around it. It's not just that narrow thing, it's kind of a cloud around it. And so, and that's maybe a fence around the law in a certain way, that you could, it's a similar idea. It's broader than it might seem in its most narrowest reading. And if you see a number of rules like that in the Constitution, and they all have this kind of cloud around them, you can start to see that that cloud might merge together, right? And in some fashion, you actually see a right that's there, even though it hasn't been explicitly stated. And in this case, that is a right to privacy. So you could look at that. Now, I'm not sure that that was the best way to make the case, to say, penumbras and emanations. It sounds kind of,
hocus pocus.
Yeah, I mean, it might have been better to say something like, you have to understand that there are abstract principles that aren't stated because they're so obvious that they don't need to be stated, or that they're so foundational that you can't have one without the other, that actually undergird these rights. So then when you look at a number of rights in the Constitution, you say, oh, they all rest on this foundation of privacy. That might have been a stronger way to put it. They might have flaws of its own, but it feels a little bit less, magical, woo-woo. So, but in any event, they're saying we're not just inserting random new rights into the Constitution. We can't do that. That's a step too far in terms of legal reasoning, because the Constitution, or in this case the Torah, the claim is that it's kind of like this was there all along, that this was part of the original architecture of it. So we can't just make something up because we like it today and drop it in there. So nobody has ever said the Constitution, directly permits abortion. It says somewhere in the Constitution abortion is permitted, it doesn't. Nobody makes that claim because that would be overly unbelievable. But to say there is this fundamental right to privacy that flows out of these other rights, and that right to privacy naturally leads its way through various other steps to protecting a woman's right to have an abortion, that is a more reasonable way to do law. So it feels to me like when we look here and we say, okay, so what we're saying here is that it's not just these three categories, these three Torah prohibitions that you can't violate, that you're not allowed to violate, even if it means that your life would be lost. There's actually a fourth.
Even if it means your life would be saved.
Even if it means your life would be saved. There's actually a fourth. That fourth would seem to have to, in some way, either flow from those three, or it could be somewhere else in the Torah. But it has to anchor itself somewhere. So there's a and then we would say, so and there's another piece where once you say there's a prohibition here that you would even have to die rather than transgress, then you would come in with the principle of kal v'chomer that says, right, that if in a case where you would have to die rather than transgress it, then clearly if there's something less than death, if it's just in conflict with another Torah prohibition, that you wouldn't have to die rather than transgress, then you should, then this is a more fundamental, more important one. So this idea of kind of adding or elevating the importance of certain Torah prohibitions is ultimately very powerful. And the reason I bring up the penumbras and emanations issue is that it's possible to say that there's a fourth category. Like, let's say that we would say that the fourth category is don't treat a person as an object, or treat a person with dignity. And like you're saying, that's why I want to really look hard at this text, that you might say, well, but it doesn't actually say that explicitly in the Torah in the way that it explicitly says don't worship idols and don't murder somebody and don't have forbidden sexual relations. It doesn't say anything about treating people with dignity. But that's where we would bring in this idea, whether it's penumbras and emanations or an abstract principle, and we would say, okay, well, there are these 10 other principles in the Torah that put them together, and they fundamentally stand for this idea that you should not treat a person as an object, you should treat someone with dignity. So I think that it's an interesting exercise as we try to expand our sense of, or change, and to do whatever within the system that the rabbis laid down, it's an interesting exercise to try to see, can we locate some of these principles in the Torah itself through a kind of penumbras and emanations type of or analysis, and that seems to be like implicitly what they might be doing here without naming it, that they're finding that that they're finding somehow this idea of we're not even going to allow a woman we're not even going to force a woman to speak from behind a wall, that maybe that has to do, like we say, with kavod habriot, with the dignity of all creations. They're finding that's one that they're finding in the more penumbras and emanations kind of category. So
yeah,
that's clear.
it's really interesting. It the penumbras and emanations technique seems to be in the category of textual interpretation, which is a different category than svara. And we've been focusing, I think, more and more on the svara underneath the various methods of tradition upgrading. But the penumbras and emanations is going back to the technique of a little bit of a wink, but not so much of a wink, right? I always make fun of penumbras and emanations. You're actually making it sound much more reasonable than I understood it.
Well, it's I think that, I'm trying to fully think this through, but I think that it has to do with like, there's a statement in the Torah that says you may not add or subtract from these laws. And you could argue that they're actually adding because the Torah doesn't say treat everybody with dignity. So you're adding a law to the Torah. The Torah explicitly says don't do that. Now, we've seen a lot of cases in this show so far where the rabbis, there's something that the Torah explicitly says, and but typically now we could say it's a wink, and we could say it's actually a reasonable, that's how law works, and maybe it's both. But there's a difference between just saying we care about this now, so we're gonna add it in, and making the claim that no, like there's a way in which we care about this now, but we've always cared about this. I mean, for me, it's often, I would say, like taking care of the earth, climate change is an interesting category, because of course that's not directly in the Torah, because nobody imagined back then that there was something that human beings could do that would affect the whole earth, but there are all kinds of things in the Torah that, it says that God is responsible for the heavens and the earth, for example. And if you say, okay, well now the things have changed, right? It's a broken time. The temple is destroyed. Things have changed. We've changed. Human beings have grown in our abilities. Now we're able to destroy the earth in the same way that God was. So therefore, where it says in the Torah that God is responsible for the heavens and the earth, now humans too are responsible for the heavens and the earth. Boom, there you go. We didn't add anything to the Torah. It was there all along. Right now, there's a prohibition against climate change. And since we see here in this text that there are certain laws that you must be killed rather than transgress, we could say not only is climate change, fighting against climate change in the Torah, it's actually such an important and fundamental principle of the Torah that we're adding it to the list of ones that you should die rather than transgress. And so therefore, if it's a question of your own life versus something that you might be doing to pollute the earth, you should not pollute the earth even at the risk of your life. Boom, we have made climate change a foundational principle of Judaism without, I would argue, making stuff up, right? In other words, so that I did that quickly, but you could do that.
The part that's jumping out at me in what you said that's so important is the move to say, no, this is not a new thing we care about. We've always cared about it. When it's not exactly true. What's true is that we have in some general way cared about this principle, but we missed until now that this principle that we cared about actually is playing out over here. That's the new piece. And it's really powerful to say, it's not a new concern. It's an old concern, but a new application, a realization that this concern is what's at stake here.
And then I wonder, and this I haven't, I didn't come to this conversation with this part sort of thought through or worked out. So I'm just floating it as something to consider for the future, is that, maybe it has to do with the specifics versus the general, in the sense that I think that a lot of us, and this actually is sometimes something that we've talked about in this show too, if we're looking at the Torah, I think that most people see this more in the Torah because most regular Jews are more familiar with the Torah than with the Talmud. And the Torah is full of these pithy statements. You should do this, you should do that, you shouldn't do this, you shouldn't do that. And you could get, I'm sort of showing my prejudice here, but you could get lost in the details of it and say, okay, so what all the Torah is saying is that there's a bunch of things you should do and a bunch of things you shouldn't do, and they're extremely specific. Or you could say, no, the specifics are meant to articulate general principles. Why would they not articulate as general principles? Well, sometimes they are, but sometimes it may be that it's just at that time they didn't know how to say that as a general principle. There wasn't a concept 3,000 years ago about the right to privacy. So it wouldn't have been able to be written in the Torah. When we have an idea about a right to privacy from our time, and we can look back and sort of see concerns in the Torah that amount to a right of privacy, or in the Constitution, I think it's legitimate to say, well, this actually has been, you can see this concern in not in the words of the Torah specifically and only, but you can see this concern in the early history of Judaism or in the early history of America. You can see this concern. And so and because we admire these people that were the founders, right? And so we don't think that they knew everything, but we admire their we have a sense of their svara, right? And they didn't always do a good job of living it out. Thomas Jefferson had slaves. There are all kinds of ways in which they were deeply problematic. And yet we have some sense that their svara was on target, so much so, at least as much as we're willing to kind of keep going with the system that they laid down. But that's very different from saying that we're therefore locked in to the specifics of what they put on the page at a certain time. And you could take that, and I often do, too far and say, so we're throwing the whole thing out, we're redoing it, we're inspired by, we're connected by, we're going to retell the story that connects it, et cetera, et cetera. And I think you can do that. But I think it's probably more powerful in all kinds of ways to say, let's really interrogate the system that they laid down, and let's see if we can derive the principles that our svara tells us is what it needs to be today. Let's see if we can derive it from what they said. Now, and it might look to, like we look at the Talmud, it might look to people 1,000 years from now like we were just playing around with it, and we weren't serious, and we were just winking. And I think maybe this is helping me see that it's not just winks. It's like they were engaged in a serious effort where they were trying, and they knew that it wasn't really perfect, and it wasn't really explicitly in the mind of the original, and there is a wink there too, something like that.
Yeah. Well, it occurs to me that traditions don't last for thousands of years unless they have really good foundational principles and values. And so I think they're there. What we need to work with is already there. We just have to apply them to the cases and the aspects of life that they didn't realize they needed to be expanded to. It's the same with democracy, and I think every story of a tradition that works. It works because it's got the right stuff. It just needs to be continually expanded to be applied to the places where folks didn't realize, those principles were absent or missing.
Yeah. Well, I think that next week we will continue this conversation in some fashion, one way or another. We have a few ideas, but not with a different text or with a different agenda. But we're continuing along similar lines. So I think it's a good time to end it for today and to pick up this conversation, which I think has moved our ball forward in ways that I didn't expect 2 weeks ago. So
yeah.
So we'll see you next week, Vinay.
Okay, great. Bye, Dan.